This is the War Memorial in Stratford, Ontario, and it's typical of all the war memorials across Canada, in every village, in every town, and in every city. And these memorials are gateways to the First World War. Unfortunately, most Canadians have forgotten the First World War, and they don't realize that it was the greatest and most traumatic episode in our history. 400,000 Canadians went overseas between 1914 and 18, and 60,000 died for King and Empire.
The peaceful countryside of northern France, dotted with war memorials and military cemeteries. It was here that were fought the final desperate battles that brought the Great War to a sudden, unexpected end. March 1918. Germany has defeated Russia and switches millions of men from the east to the Western Front to launch the greatest offensive yet, the Kaiser's Battle. After 4 years of war, Germany's hopes for victory now ride on stormtroops, such as 22-year-old Lieutenant Ernst Junger.
March 21st, the hurricane broke loose. Compared with it, all preceding battles were child's play. We were all in transports over this elemental expression of German power and were burning with impatience. The decisive battle, the final advance, had begun. At stake was the possession of the world.
We're on the Douai Plain, and it was here in 1918 that the Canadians prepared the defenses to stop the great German offensive they all knew was coming. It was also near here in January 1918 that my grandfather's war came to an end. While playing cards with a number of his friends in a tent, a shrapnel shell burst overhead, and a shrapnel ball entered his cheek and came out the bottom of his neck here. For him, it involved being evacuated out and having his jaw wired for 1 year, and his war was over. The rest of the Canadian Corps were now in lines very close to the Germans, out by Lens and through all these small villages and out on the plain. They were digging trenches at a phenomenal rate, putting up barbed wire, building machine gun redoubts, because everyone knew the Germans were coming.
Spring 1918. In the whirlwind attack of the Kaiser's offensive, millions of stormtroops overwhelmed the British and French armies, sending them reeling back towards Paris and the Atlantic coast. By early summer, the Germans are a breath away from victory. But in July, the Allied High Command decides on a bold gamble, a counterattack, and as its spearhead they choose the one army the Germans have carefully avoided attacking, the Canadian Corps, the conquerors of Vimy Ridge. In the summer of 1918, the Canadian Corps is perhaps the deadliest Allied force on the Western Front. Its commander, Arthur Currie, knows that the Germans are well aware of this. So if he is to move his 100,000 men, Currie must do it in the utmost secrecy. The ancient French cathedral city of Amiens, astride the Somme River. It was here that the great German advance had been stopped, blocking their march to the sea. It's from Amiens that the Allies plan to make their counterstroke, and it is from Vimy to Amiens that the Canadian Corps must move. To trick the Germans, decoy Canadian units are sent north to Belgium, while in total secrecy, Arthur Currie moves his army of 100,000 men 60 kilometers south to Amiens. Traveling only at night, the Corps moves under a total blackout. Among the thousands of troops is 24-year-old John Harold Becker.
Not a man in our platoon had any idea where we were. We marched for a long time in a forest in pitch blackness and finally halted and fell off to the side of the narrow road under the trees and lay down in the rain.
This is Gentel's Wood, and it was a wood behind the front lines for the Battle of Amiens. The Battle of Amiens was the big breaking point in the war. It was the first time the Germans were beaten, and it would be the last time that the flow of the war would change. The big idea for Amiens was that in the March offensives, the Germans had pushed everyone back so far, but had outrun their abilities to really defend the positions that they had won. So they had a whole series of large salients that were weakly defended, with just some barbed wire, machine guns, and trenches. It was really ripe for the picking in August 1918. The problem for the Canadians was that they were moving into this front in total secrecy. And how do you hide 100,000 men moving south? In Gentel's Wood was one area where they hid the Canadian troops before the attack. And in this wood would be thousands of Canadian troops hiding from German observation and waiting to move up to the front to launch the attack.
It was the first time I had seen real enthusiasm on the eve of an attack. Our move to this front had been so unusual, the news of surprise was so intriguing, and the information given us by our officers so encouraging that every man seemed ready to go. As for myself, I did not feel any particular elation, but I certainly wanted something to happen.
As eager for something to happen as his boys is a Canadian Army chaplain in his late 50s, Canon Frederick Scott. In 4 years of fighting, Canon Scott has seen thousands die, losing his own son at the Somme. When 2,000 Allied guns opened fire at 4:15 in the morning of August 8th, Canon Scott has every reason to rejoice.
I could not help shouting out, "Glory be to God for this barrage!" The German reply came, but to our delight it was feeble, and we knew we had taken them by surprise.
Sweeping forward with the Australians on their left and the French on their right, Canadian infantry quickly move out into open country, into a new, fast-moving kind of warfare, with tanks, aircraft, field artillery, all racing forward together in an attack designed to drive the Germans away from Amiens.
We're driving through the Luce River Valley. This whole valley was shrouded in mist when the Canadians came through here. It was the most difficult part of the operation, and they had to sweep around the river. They were totally successful, and they quickly pushed beyond the woods and the river into the open country beyond. That's characteristic of the Amiens battlefield. They broke through the German front lines, which were not very strong, and then pushed into open territory. Going also now up this road into Hangard and Hangard Woods, which is the jump-off position for the 1st Canadian Division. And of course, our old friend Ken Scott is right there. He's now about, he must be 55, 56 years old. And he's right up there with the boys as they're moving across the territory here.
In the fields in different directions, I could see rifles stuck, bayonet downwards, in the ground, which showed that there lay wounded men. I found that these were chiefly Germans, and that all of them had received hideous wounds and were clamoring for water. I think all the Germans I saw that morning were dying.
The first wave of Canadian infantry moves so fast, it quickly pushes beyond the range of its heavy guns and runs into a wall of bullets from German machine gunners. Lieutenant James Pedley was so eager to get to the fighting, he'd hitched a ride from Paris, but soon regrets his haste.
Crack. Moreau is hit. He falls back, then stiffens in a final convulsion and collapses. A tap on my shoulder. Looking around, I see an officer of the 2nd Brigade. He is fresh, eager. Sections of unmuddied men are climbing the hill behind him. "May I go through you, sir?" he says, a phrase from the golf links happily transplanted. You bet your life he may go through.
The battle on the 8th of August actually ended in these fields out here. This is the only place for the entire day that the Canadians did not reach their objective. The 4th Division were hung up in the woods across here, and Germans started to bring up reinforcements and catch the men in the open fields. And when they were advancing across here, they were put down and had to take cover in whatever shell holes they could get. The day had been phenomenally successful. They had advanced 8 miles, captured all objectives except for this one, and they were ready to push for another day on August the 9th.
The whiz-bangs came smashing in among us at a terrifying rate. I turned my head to see if the boys were still with me, and one of the whiz-bangs burst right in front of me. And instantly, something kicked me with a jolt. Stunned, I lay still for a minute. Then I yelled, "I'm hit!"
As the sun sets on the 8th of August, Harold Becker stumbles towards a dressing station, his back shattered by shrapnel. The next morning, James Pedley's legs are cut from under him by a flail of machine gun bullets. Becker and Pedley have their blighties, soldiers' slang for a wound that takes a man safely out of the war. Others are not so lucky.
In the ambulance, there was a taciturn fellow. I speak to him once or twice, but he only grunts an answer. Who the devil does he think he is? Too proud to answer when you speak to him? Unexpectedly, the light shoots upward and reveals the broad white bandage wound around the man's head. The truth comes over me. For him, the game is played out. He is blind.
On the 9th, they put in new troops, and they launch another big offensive against the Germans. They come through this position, they capture Luc Quinnell village, and they push on for another 4 miles. Both days were phenomenal victories, but there was a very heavy cost for both days.
Against ferocious German resistance, the Canadians claw their way forward for 10 more days, capturing 10,000 German prisoners and 200 guns. As planned, surprise has been total. The Canadian advance of 24 kilometers makes Amiens the greatest British victory yet. It reverses the tide of the war. The Kaiser's battle, which had almost defeated the Allies, has become the Kaiser's ruin. And glimpsing now a possibility of winning the war, and quickly, the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Douglas Haig, congratulates the Canadians on their stunning success.
Movements now were very rapid. This was real war, and we were advancing daily. We heard of the victories of the French and Americans to the south. It was glorious to think that after the bitter experience of the previous march, the tables had been turned, and we had got the initiative once more.
The Allies have the initiative, but the cost of the 11-day battle has been heavy. 12,000 Canadians missing, wounded, and dead, and after Amiens, the war still has 90 days to go. Whatever the battle has cost the Allies, for the Germans it is a military catastrophe, shattering their hope of conquering Europe. To stave off defeat, the German army retreats, regrouping near the Hindenburg Line, an interlocking wall of pillboxes, machine gun nests, artillery emplacements, and kilometer-wide fields of barbed wire, the most formidable defensive system in Europe. It is against the Hindenburg Line that the Allied High Command will next throw the Canadians, ordering their commander, Arthur Currie, to do the impossible, crack Germany's wall of steel, whatever the cost. With the victory at Amiens, the Allies had stopped the Germans cold. But ahead lies Germany's most formidable defensive system, the Hindenburg Line. The French and British governments believe it will take years and millions more dead to end the war. But boldly gambling on the possibility of a quick victory, the Allied High Command risks a new offensive and orders General Arthur Currie and the Canadian Corps to crack the Hindenburg Line. The Canadians will attack from just outside the French city of Arras. Arras, 1918, the once beautiful city, with its cathedral and monasteries and 17th century squares, lies at the heart of the British sector. After 4 years within range of German guns, Arras has been pounded into ruin.
Merci. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
It's market day in Arras, and this was the main city that was behind the Canadian lines throughout 1918. With the German shelling, life was very intense here, so a lot of the men would go underground, and they lived in the caves underneath Arras and in the basements or the caves in the areas around the Grand Place and the Petit Place. We're in the souterrain under the Hotel de Ville at Arras. It's a series of chambers that were built about the 16th century and were used by First World War troops to be safe from the Germans throughout the war. It held over 10,000 troops. It had a whole lighting system and water system. It was almost a home away from home.
I made my way to Arras and spent the night in one of the mysterious caves which lie under that city. It was a most curious abode. No one knows when the caves were dug. They were probably extended from time to time as the chalk was quarried for the purpose of building the town. Long passages stretched in different directions, and from them opened out huge vaulted chambers where the battalions were billeted.
General Currie doesn't let the Canadians rest in the city, but orders them right into action. Over battlefields where the cream of the British Army had been slaughtered in 1917, it now takes the Canadians 4 days of savage fighting in late August 1918 just to penetrate to the outworks of the Hindenburg Line.
Men were carrying out wounded on stretchers. I heard someone call my name. Going to where some wounded were lying, I saw Sadal. He looked up. "Tell me straight," he whispered. "Do you think I've got mine?" He was frightfully wounded like the cases beside him. "I think you have," I said. "Is there anything I can do?" Sadal begged me to sit beside him till he went to sleep. It was a strange experience to sit there without talking and wait till he was gone. The men on the other 2 stretchers were both dead, and shortly, Sadal was too. Will Bird, 42nd Battalion.
On the first 2 days of the battle, August 26th and August 27th, the Canadians had advanced further in those 2 days than the whole British Army had advanced in 2 months in 1917. They were doing really well until they came up against the German positions on this ridge. And the Canadians were not ready for this. Their advance had outstripped their artillery, and once they got against these German positions, it was basically small groups of men advancing and really getting caught in the uncut barbed wire. It was the same problem that they had in the Somme in 1916. In the little valley over here, the 2nd Canadian Division was wiped out, and it literally became the graveyard of the 2nd Division.
Undaunted by such losses, the Canadians regroup for the attack. Their target is now a section of the Hindenburg Line called the Drocourt-Quéant, or DQ Line, a kilometer-thick barrier of dugouts, fortifications, trenches, and fields of barbed wire. Currie concentrates his men and guns at one slender point. His daring plan: punch a narrow hole through the German line and have his troops fan out behind the Germans once they have broken through. The attack begins. Scrambling right after the first wave of the Canadian assault is a fragile-looking signaller, Victor Wheeler. When Victor joined up, the doctors told him he wouldn't last 3 months. By now, with most of his friends already dead, Victor is a veteran of 2 years fighting.
Hitting the DQ line, we lost so many officers that many privates and NCOs were suddenly filling the breaches in the ranks. Of our 6 runners, only 1 survived. Signaller Scott was struck in the neck, and Charlie MacDonald's leg was blown off at the hip. But by 8:30 in the morning, after very heavy fighting, some of it hand-to-hand, we had captured the first 4 lines of the Drocourt-Quéant trench system and were within 440 yards of the town of Dury, our first objective.
This is a piece of the Drocourt-Quéant line. It's a spike from the First World War that somehow has surfaced through the mud after years and years of plowing in this field. This is an actual piece of the Drocourt-Quéant line, probably held the revetments in, or some of the little bridges they used to have over the top of the trenches. This is a Drury Mill cemetery. It was made right after the battle from all the bodies that were laying in the barbed wire and the men that were killed up here. As you can see by this cemetery and the fighting at the Drocourt-Quéant line, the Germans had by no way given up, and they were fighting a very hard battle, and they still had Cambrai to go. They had one more major battle. In fact, in the 60 days in August and September 1918, 1 in 5 of all the Canadians killed in the war were killed.
Breaking through the DQ line brings the Canadians close to their ultimate objective, the pivot of the German army's supply system in France, the city of Cambrai, only 10 kilometers away. All along the Western Front, the German armies are in retreat. But the fighting has 60 days to go, and lying between the Canadians and Cambrai is the biggest single barrier of the Hindenburg Line. The heavily fortified, 20-meter-wide Canal du Nord is the most treacherous obstacle the Canadians have ever faced. The Canal du Nord, a wide, peaceful waterway in the fertile agricultural plain of northern France, easily crossed now in a matter of seconds. But in late September 1918, it is the most dangerous obstacle on the Western Front. And it is this obstacle that the Canadians are poised to attack. So bold and so risky is Arthur Currie's plan to cross the canal that the British command, usually not adverse to sacrificing soldiers' lives, vetoes it. But Currie insists, and he prevails.
This canal at that time was water from here up and from about 2 miles down, but in this area it was dry. They hadn't finished the construction of the canal. This attack that the Canadians were going to do was probably the hardest that they threw at anybody during the whole war, at least the most complex, because they decided that the whole attack was going to be funneled through this dry part of the canal bed. And then everybody, which is about 60,000 troops, would have to fan out to attack other positions.
As we waited to cross the Canal du Nord, probably never in the war had we experienced a moment of deeper anxiety. The men would have to climb down one side of the canal, rush across it, and climb up the other. It seemed inevitable that the slaughter would be frightful.
They did the same thing as they did at Amiens. They had all their men hiding in the woods, and this was a deadly operation because if the Germans found them, gas shells and high explosive would have caused thousands of casualties. But anyway, Currie, who was the commander at that time, decided this is the attack he was going to make, and with a thundering barrage, the men stormed across the canal just where we're going right now. All across here, about 4,000 Canadian troops led the attack and pushed into these fields. Half of them went north to attack Marquion, and the other half pushed straight across the fields towards Bourlon.
Currie's boldness pays off. The Canadians rush the canal, punch through German defenses, and fan out north and south, heading for the final objective, Cambrai.
Shortly after crossing the canal, all officers in D Company became casualties. Soon there were so many casualties, we had to reorganize 2 companies on the spot. Badly battered as we were, we continued to drive forward into the hurricane while SOS messages went out for replacement officers. Corporal Victor Wheeler.
Well, the first stage of the battle had gone very well, and now they're just streaming through. The troops are just, the fields are full of the Canadians advancing. They're coming up to Bourlon Wood. Bourlon Wood had been destroyed in the fighting in 1917 when the British tried to capture it, and really they held on for a while but couldn't hold it. The Canadians just swept right by it. Troops went around it, both north and south, and troops also poured through it. So within about a day, Bourlon Wood and the village of Bourlon was in Canadian hands, and they're pushing the attack towards Cambrai. The problem occurred here was that after Bourlon, they outstripped their artillery again, and they're going against German defenses on the outskirts of Cambrai that they really don't know anything about, whether they're slit trenches or machine guns or barbed wire. They have no real idea of what's facing them. So Bourlon was part of the successful 2 days after clearing the Canal du Nord, but they're going to run into a lot more trouble as they close in on the suburbs, the little villages around Cambrai. The Canadian Corps on 27 September 1918 forced the Canal du Nord and captured this hill. They took Cambrai, Denain, Valenciennes, and Mons.
Canon Scott is with the troops, as in a dozen days of non-stop and exceptionally bitter fighting, they slowly drive the Germans back across the fields, pausing only at night.
In the morning, I went back again to our men in the line. The country was undulating, and German machine gun emplacements were in all directions, and our men suffered very severely.
In just the first day, after storming across the Canal du Nord, the Canadians had advanced more than 4 kilometers and lost thousands of men.
Private G. Elport, Royal Canadian Regiment, 28 September 1918, age 22. He did his best. Private G. Burton, 52nd Battalion, Canadian Infantry, 28 September 1918, age 31. He fought with heroes side by side. He died that we might live, ever remembered. The fighting on September the 27th had broken the Canal du Nord line and the German Marquion line, and the Canadians had stormed through Bourlon Wood over here, and they were crossing these fields going towards Cambrai. On the 28th, new troops came up to relieve the tired ones, and they continued their attack against the German position called the Marcoing line. The Marcoing line was a trench system, not too elaborate, lots of barbed wire that ran from these villages across this little valley here and into these small villages that are really suburbs of Cambrai. From here, the Canadians could actually see Cambrai, And if you can imagine, on the 28th of September, from this church over here, all the way across to the factory buildings on the Douai Road, the Canadians were assaulting on the German positions. The problem was the Germans were inside these little villages here, and they had fortified all the villages, and they put up barbed wire, and basically the Canadians didn't know where they were. They didn't have the proper maps or reconnaissance to help them with the attack. They had outstripped a lot of their artillery, and now it was getting very difficult for them to break through to Cambrai. And in fact, this is where Canon Scott's war ends, where he's watching the spires of Cambrai like we are now, and he's actually wounded. And that's the end of him for the war.
Suddenly, there was a tremendous crash in front of us. A lot of earth was blown into our faces, and we both fell down. I'd been wounded in both legs, and from one I saw blood streaming down from my buddies. The chaplain of the 10th Battalion, who happened to be standing in the sunken road, got some men together quickly and came out to our help. I was carried off immediately to an ambulance in the road and placed in it with 4 others, one of whom was dying. Our journey lay through the area over which we had just made the great advance. Through the open door at the end of the ambulance as we sped onward, I could see the brown, colorless stretch of country fade in the twilight and then vanish into complete darkness. And I knew that the great adventure of my life, among the most glorious men that the world had ever produced, had come to an end.
After almost 4 years sharing the troops' hardships and dangers, and giving comfort to wounded and dying Canadians, under fire and on every battlefield, Canon Scott's own wounds will keep him far from the action. The victory he had dreamed of, and which required the death of his own son, is just 40 days away, but Canon Scott will not be there to see it.
We're in the Hotel de Ville of Cambrai, overlooking the Grand Place, where the Canadians marched on October the 9th, 1918. Some of the most famous photographs from the period are the Canadian troops coming in here, the 3rd Division men who had crossed the canals and found themselves into the square here. They walked around here, and of course the whole thing is on fire. So the city itself hadn't been damaged so much from the war, but the Germans, who were seeking retribution and to destroy everything they possibly could, had just torched the place.
Reaching the center of Cambrai, no one is more surprised than the Canadians that the Germans have abandoned the city, slipping away like thieves in the night. But the Germans had no choice. With the British Army closing in from the south and the Canadians from the north, the German command realized they were about to be trapped. With strategic Cambrai gone, even the German Kaiser Wilhelm II has to admit the war is lost. The torching of the city signals the beginning of the end for Germany. But the burning of Cambrai is just one act of cruelty amongst many. During their 4-year occupation of Belgium and northern France, the Germans have destroyed hundreds of villages, uprooted orchards, slaughtered livestock, forced populations of men and women into slave labor, and executed thousands of hostages.
After Cambrai, you're talking about the 9th, the 10th, 11th of October, there was no timeout. The idea was to stay on the heels of the Germans, don't let them build any more defensive works. Because if you give them time, they'll build another line and you'll lose another 10,000 men trying to get through it. So the idea was to keep the pressure up. So after Cambrai, and for the next month and a half, they just kept pushing them.
In spite of the loss of Cambrai, the Germans fight a series of bloody rearguard actions, inflicting heavy losses. Battling ahead without rest, the Canadians thrust into occupied territory for the first time. Emile Seger, a professional cartoonist, now a fighting soldier, is in the midst of the Canadian advance.
our first inhabited French town. As we entered, the street was empty. The Germans, we were told later, had warned the people to stay in their cellars. Soon, faces peered from windows. Then, in an instant, the villagers began to pour from the doorways, singing and shouting, "Vive les Canadiens!" Children danced. Old women rushed out with mugs and steaming pots of ersatz coffee and slices of brown bread. It was about all they had, but they insisted on sharing it with us. At Roule, the population who, only moments ago, had been liberated after 4 years as captive, were wild with joy. They embraced hundreds of us at random. Even the commanding officer did not escape the kisses. Corporal Victor Wheeler.
Advancing north, the Allies find the roads blocked with thousands of refugees, just as the German command had planned. To slow down the Allied advance, German soldiers deliberately destroyed the population's homes and sources of food. As the Canadians push further into occupied territory, they discover there is an ironic and dark side to their role as liberators. As thousands of German soldiers are captured or surrender, the Canadians are caught in an unenviable situation. Having fought for 4 years to protect the French and the Belgians from the Germans, Canadian soldiers like Will Byrd now find it is the Germans who need protection.
We saw a man running at top speed. He was bareheaded and without a tunic, but his gray trousers and boots told us he was a German officer. We watched. Women came running from the village, and men. Some of the women were carrying pitchforks. The German slowed, seemed to stagger, glanced around wildly, started off again, and suddenly was surrounded. We could see clubs being used, and pitchforks.
As the Canadians advance into Belgium, messages chronicling Germany's collapse stream towards Allied command. Lille and Ostend are now in our hands. The Hun evacuated Douai in the night. 1st Division walked right in. Zeebrugge and Bruges have been captured. Entire Belgian coast freed. For the Canadians, the last battle of the Great War will take place at the Belgian city of Mons. Suddenly aware that the war is almost over, each soldier begins to think of himself. Nobody wants to be the last man to die.
On the 10th of November, the 42nd Battalion, the Black Watch of Canada, including Will Byrd, arrived near Mons. They took over the positions just beside the city. They were preparing for a nice, easy rest until the Armistice, when they received word from the Canadian Corps, coming from Arthur Currie, the commander, that they would be asked to move on Mons. The men were very unhappy about this, but nonetheless they followed their orders. They figured the war was just about over and this was not required. But on the night of November the 10th, just south of this train station, D Company of the 42nd Battalion and Will Byrd made their move on Mons. And it was going to be the final action of the Canadian Corps in the Great War.
In Mons in 1914, the British suffered their first defeat of the Great War when the Germans drove British troops from the city. Now in 1918, with only 24 hours to go, Arthur Currie orders the Canadians to take the city and end the British Empire's war where it began. November the 10th, 1918, Will Byrd and Tommy, and the brothers Tom and Jim Mills, Will's friends of the 42nd Battalion he's fought side by side with for years, are camped just outside the city of Mons. They can hardly believe that the end of the horror is in sight.
Byrd. It was the voice of the company sergeant major, harsh as a whipsaw. Get your section at once. Battle order. We're going to take Mons. Tom Mills and his brother Jim are on their feet. The war's over tomorrow and everybody knows it. What kind of rot is this? The sergeant major's face was pale and set. He was not speaking in his normal voice at all. Orders are orders. Get your gear. 5 or 6 of the men were shouting at us to turn around and attack our headquarters. The officers, they said, were worse enemies than any German.
So Will and his buddies have to fight their way into Mons, just hours before the armistice. And at dusk, Wilbert kills his last German.
The Germans had set up their machine gun in the middle of the street. I lay on my side and peered forward. One German had his helmet off as if adjusting the strap. I shot the rifle grenade. It exploded at shoulder height over the machine gun. I went forward. 2 of the Germans lay as they had fallen. The third had crawled across the sidewalk and was lying there. The way was clear.
The Canadians capture Mons, but in the last day, 38 Canadians die, including Tom Mills.
Jim Mills is wild-eyed. He says he's gonna shoot whoever arranged to have his brother killed for nothing. He really means it. He's hoping Curry comes here today. If he doesn't, he's gonna shoot the next higher up. He says his brother was murdered. An officer says, "Take Jim and get him drunk. So drunk he won't know anything for 24 hours. Then it'll be too late, and he'll forget all about it."
It was not likely that Jim Mills and the others would forget their friends and their brothers, who had died in what would be the last day of the Great War. Mons, 11th of November, 1918, dawn.
Hostilities will cease at 1100 hours, November 11th. Troops will stand fast on the line reached that hour, which will be reported to brigade headquarters. Defensive precautions will be maintained. There will be no intercourse of any description with the enemy.
We're in the Hotel de Ville in the Grand Place of Mons. By the early morning of November the 11th, Canadian troops had infiltrated most of the city and were filtering through to the Grand Place here. The Germans had gone, and already civilians were coming out of their houses in a very celebratory mood, cheering on the troops, and the Canadians were starting to fill the square. By about 7 a.m., they got news that the armistice was in fact going ahead, and at 11 a.m., the war would end. So the Grand Place here in front of us was just loaded with French and Belgian civilians all through the area. And the Canadian troops, many of them kilted, like Will Bird's boys, and the RCRs and the Princess Patricias were all coming into the place here. In a sign of honor, the Belgian civilians had brought all the dead Canadians killed in the last part of the battle and laid them out here and covered them with flowers and wreaths. And the whole square was just full. The Canadian troops were exhausted, but they still got into the mood of things. They then had a number of speeches by the early morning into the afternoon by the local dignitaries, the mayor, and so ended the Great War.
When he enters the city, General Curry is pleased to learn that the last 24 hours of fighting and the victory at Mons has cost only 38 dead. The Belgians organize a tribute for the Canadians who died liberating Mons.
Gentlemen of the Canadian Corps, we bow, filled with respect and deep feeling before the tomb of your comrades. In so doing, we enshrine in our hearts the remembrance of what they were and what they have done for us. From afar, brothers, we knew not came to us to strive beside us, and with how much suffering, with how much effort, with how much sorrow have they paid for it. Noble Canada has shed rivers of blood. Belgium is free, and civilization is saved.
You really get a sense of the euphoria that would have been here at the time. It would have just been an incredible circumstance to stand here. 4 years of suffering, for everybody, all the death and all the people who weren't here, the remembrance of all the people who had gone. And that's really what I feel strong about when I'm here, is the sense of history and the finality of the First World War.
In 4 years fighting for king and empire, the Canadian Corps had suffered 60,000 dead. Paying this terrible price, the naive amateurs of 1914 had become by 1918 the most feared troops on the Western Front, masters of war. 4 years fighting in the most deadly war in history had transformed men like Will Byrd and their world. As millions of veterans would soon discover, nothing could ever be the same again.
There was no jubilation. We sat around and saw pictures. Mud holes, faces, barbed wire, stand-to parapets, still forms under blankets, boots, worn and muddied boots protruding from ambulances, pitiful khaki forms huddled on the duck boards. War we had seen, and we had seen through it.